Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was just going to introduce Arun. Is that okay, Grant?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So our next speaker, Arun Venkataraman is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets, and he's the Director General of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. He was appointed by President Biden and confirmed by the U.S. Senate on April 7, 2022, to lead the federal government's efforts to promote exports abroad and attract inward investment. Arun has over 20 years of experience advising companies, international organizations, and the U.S. government on international trade issues. So welcome, Arun.
Thanks so much for that, Jeff. And let me first apologize for my screen. My computer camera died this morning, which makes me wonder who's been messing with it. But so I'm on my phone, so apologies for that. But it's great to be here with all of you. And thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I know this committee has done and will continue to do invaluable work that we will all depend on. And I'm happy to be here to be part of it, to take your input, and really pleased to see your interest in the work that we are doing in the Global Markets Business Unit of the International Trade Administration. As Jeff said, I have probably the longest title in the federal government, but which is all just a bunch of words, a fancy way of saying that, our job is to promote U.S. business interests abroad by supporting exports of U.S. goods and services, and working very closely with companies, helping them find partners overseas to sell their goods and services to, working with foreign governments to help our companies win in public tenders, and working with foreign companies to encourage them to invest in the United States. So your recommendations are really going to help guide us because, not surprisingly, increasingly we are focusing our work on supporting the supply chain initiatives that Grant and others are really spending so much time on. And there's a real role here for us to play in doing that. So I thank you for recognizing that and look forward to touching on your recommendations. Grant, let me turn it to you.
Great, thanks. Jeff and Ursula, if it's all right with you, I was going to talk a little bit about industry and analysis and tag team with Arun and respond to some of the recommendations as well. Okay. Sounds great. Okay, great. So thanks again for having us. Again, I'm the Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis. Assistant Secretary Venkataraman and I are colleagues here in the International Trade Administration within the Department of Commerce. And so we work hand in hand. I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Industry and Analysis Shop does, because I think it will be helpful, especially as you're crafting additional recommendations. And I want to weave into that some examples of how we've already been taking on board the recommendations that you've provided. And just to recap the recommendations that Arun and I are really focused on for this time, you made great recommendations about wanting to prioritize existing and potential export markets, about thinking where there's the most economic growth potential, matching the industries and export markets and the opportunities with the work that we're doing, seeking fair access, and addressing tariff and non-tariff barriers. That's a lot of the work that we do day in and day out, but there was also a lot of room with these recommendations for us to incorporate it further. And so we've been huddling within the Department of Commerce, not just Arun and I, but with all of our colleagues across various bureaus too. So I promised a little bit of background on industry and analysis. It should be straightforward since those names only sound similar to 6 or so other bureaus within the Department of Commerce. And other than being entirely not straightforward, the heart of what we do is help U.S. industries compete abroad. And we do that by having sectoral analysts who have depth in these. We've got our chips analysts, our auto analysts. We've got people working in services and supply chain logistics across the board, from travel and tourism to industries that cover 90% of GDP or equivalent. We also put out analysis that we use both to try to inform internal policymaking, but also to help companies make their decisions and support them. And Arun will be talking a lot more about his work and his foreign commercial service officers posted abroad that help particularly in matchmaking and deal making and much more commercial advocacy and other things that he'll speak to. We are more based in Washington, D.C., putting out things like recently reports on cold chain services or supply chain sustainability that have been posted on our website. So these analytical tools and market intelligence, et cetera, they're essentially help industries compete, find the right markets, create programs, and design policies that will foster this and build manufacturing and jobs. We do a lot of the supply chain work as well. And again, the work ranges from clean tech to data privacy, cybersecurity, many different areas. So I wanted to touch on a few ways that we do this and give some more examples. Part of what we're trying to do, particularly as we think about your recommendation on being strategic and finding markets, is we've been thinking about what's happening in the world and what's happening, for instance, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and how that is affecting the needs of European partners, and how there's an opportunity here for small modular reactors and a public-private program that Arun and I are both involved in to help both European partners and provide for energy needs, and to think about longer term solutions as well, and how we're trying to be more responsive, not just in the face of Russian aggression, but the underlying energy needs. And we see a global market size here, potentially up to $300 billion by 2040. It's one of many examples where, as we scan the horizon and we think about how industries may have unique comparative advantages from what the US industries can put on offer, how we can be working together, both with public and private sector partners, to be advancing it. Part of this includes a lot of data tools, and I won't regale you with the entire list, but I'd be happy to provide it offline. It includes the types of things like an FTA tariff tool, so that exporters could go online and look at what their current tariff rates are under a free trade agreement and when that tariff will go to zero. Or a market diversification tool, so that potentially new export markets could be discovered with exporters looking at their trade patterns and what they're focused on in their existing markets. And then we would connect to them based on that information with Arun's team to talk more specifically about different geographies and markets that they could enter. But we slice data in a number of ways. We've got a team of great trade economists, and we put out a lot of that information online. Another way that we try to be strategic in connecting exporters to these markets is through particular programs. One is called a Market Development Cooperator Program. It's one of our most successful export assistance programs, dollar for dollar, because these projects generate about $309 in exports for every $1 of funding. It's a small program, but it has outsized impact. And the types of things that this would cover would be working with partners this year from California, Georgia, Louisiana, New Jersey, Oregon, Virginia, that are seeking industry footholds or to expand their footprint in geographies or through programs to help them take advantage of new export opportunities and markets. So this, again, is very much driven by the demand and the opportunities that the private sector is seeing. We're trying to layer on top of that our what we're seeing in the markets and our work globally to support it. We have other ones like a strategic partnership program that have similar intent, and we are particularly focused on serving underserved communities. Through that, we've hosted several thousand events in the last year, had several thousand participants at our events in the last year, and we're trying to deepen the outreach of what we do by providing information to make sure that these companies have an informed view. To give another couple of examples of how we're trying to be responsive to is we're taking a look at specifically on our export market rankings and our related work. How can we be taking on board these recommendations? We've traditionally been trying to rank the best prospective markets for different specific industries and subsectors. Maybe some of you have seen our top expert market rankings or top market reports in the past. We're trying to be more strategically prioritized there. We're trying to match that to greater demand and need. And we're focusing on a couple for this year, hopefully by the end of the 2022, on clean tech, for instance, and also travel and tourism. And it's a place where in receiving these recommendations in June, and as we were taking a look on what we thought would be best to try to accomplish by the end of the year, we thought this might be a very tangible way to be responsive and building on what we think is a great point. I wanted to hit just a few other examples of how we're building on these recommendations and then turn it over to Arun to add. Another thing that we do in partnership with Arun is trade missions. And I'm going to be leading a trade mission on Friday to Asia on advanced manufacturing. And this is a place where the recommendations that you've been making have already been top of mind as the team has huddled and thought about what the priorities are for such a trip, this one in particular, and the types of issues that I would be raising with governments while there. It'll include stops in Indonesia and Singapore and Japan. And in addition to taking a delegation of US small and medium-sized enterprises that are looking to expand their export sales and do more work in the region, it's also a chance for me to work with foreign counterparts and governments on policy priorities, from semiconductors and data flows to emerging tech and standards, a lot of non-tariff barriers and issues as well that we're focused on this team and that we'll be carrying forward. One last note on our national export strategy as we think about that going forward. Here too, as we're drafting what will be the follow-on to a 2016 document, we'll be releasing a national export strategy in the coming months, which we've been incorporating the recommendations that you've been providing as well, and thinking about how we can have this be as responsive as possible. We're going to be looking through this national export strategy to address the core Biden-Harris administration priorities, particularly climate change, supporting US clean technology exports, supporting small and underserved businesses through export promotion, helping with the recovery of industries that were hurt by the pandemic, other issues like travel and tourism and international education. There'll be a lot of priorities included in this, but we've been trying to think in particular, in light of what you've recommended, how can we be as strategic as possible in expanding US manufacturing and enhancing private sector competitiveness and infrastructure development, and creating more opportunities across the board for farmers, ranchers, fishers, et cetera. So that's a small taste. I get admittedly a bit excited about the breadth of the work that's done in this shop. So sometimes I'm told I go through it with a little bit too much excitement, maybe a little bit too much speed, but I just wanted to show that as we're working day to day, we're constantly referencing these recommendations and thinking about how we can do more on them. Arun, back over to you.
Thanks, Grant. Let me turn to respond to the recommendation about prioritizing and identifying potential export markets. In global markets, this is, again, as Grant said, this is the bread and butter of our work. And we, in addition to the counseling services and the export promotion tools that we offer clients through our offices domestically, we have over 100 offices across the United States, and then our foreign service offices that are in over 80 countries. And so through those offices, we take small businesses and we hold their hands and guide them through the exporting process, including the development of an export plan as part of their business plan, the identification of potential markets, the identification of potential barriers and how they might address them, and ultimately to finding potential customers that could be their business partners overseas. One of the tools that we use for this that is publicly available is what we call our country commercial guides. Our country commercial guides are prepared by our team, and what they do is for each market, they identify what we believe in that particular market are the most promising sectors for delivery of US exports. And then we go through the actual condition of that market. So we look at some of what customs procedures are like, how regulations and standards are approached in that market. We identify the variety of business channels and the channels of distribution that can support exports. And we work with identifying some of the other aspects of the business environment and the investment climate to help inform potential exporters and potential exporters of the particularities of that market as well as the potential of that market. We have country commercial guides for most of the markets in which we operate, and those are available publicly at, I can give you the website, it's trade.gov/CCG-landing-page. And these are available because as publicly, we work very closely with our INA colleagues as we develop these tools. We also have other tools available on the website that are released on a more interim basis in between the publication of these country commercial guides. And these are more like short pieces that provide the latest information, new developments, what we call market intelligence articles about new developments in those particular markets, as well as short pieces on particular export solutions that can help companies that are facing unique challenges and what they might do to address those challenges. So that, as I said, these publications, which are available online, are on top of the counseling that we do with companies individually. And so in those, you'll see the markets that we've identified, or so rather, we go through each market and identify what the priority sectors might be for opportunities for U.S. exporters. As part of our job, we also, of course, fight every day for ensuring that our companies are treated fairly, have access to the markets that they're entitled to, and we work with other agencies to help make sure that U.S. companies win contracts overseas. And so what we do as part of this part of our work is one thing we do is we certainly combat existing trade barriers that we see. So we have situations where one example is in India, where they had a personal data protection law that was going to impose significant restrictions on companies' ability to move data, but also impose new unprecedented requirements for companies to share data, including data that constituted trade secrets. We've been working with the Indian government to raise, support industry and raise concerns about that. And India just pulled down that personal data protection bill. We're not out of the woods yet, but that's one example of where we were able to be effective in working with the Indian government to combat existing barriers. We similarly work with our enforcement and compliance business unit through an entity called the Trade Agreements, Negotiations, and Compliance Division. And with that group, we leverage the commitments that we have under our WTO agreements and our free trade agreements, and leverage those commitments to advocate for changes in policies. So for example, we had a situation in Thailand where we had some testing and labeling requirements on motorcycles that were inconsistent with WTO rules. And we were able to use those rules to pressure Thailand ultimately to modify those testing requirements in support of American exports. So that's our piece on fighting the existing barriers. We also work with governments to support the implementation of agreements that we have reached with them. So we see this particularly in areas like trade facilitation, where we work very closely with our DHS colleagues to support government's efforts to streamline their customs mechanisms as required by the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement and some MOUs that we have with certain governments. We also have a division at Commerce that we work very closely with called the Commercial Law Development Program, where with their help, we work closely with governments to help them draft procurement laws that are consistent with the WTO Government Procurement Agreement and our free trade agreements, to make sure that those transparency requirements and non-discrimination requirements and other elements that are so critical for U.S. companies to be able to compete fairly for those tenders actually are implemented as they should be. The last piece of this is where we work with governments ex ante to really shape the rules before governments even maybe are thinking about those rules. And so we have dialogues, for example, in Brazil, we have a standards dialogue where we were able to, over several years of working with them to develop a shared approach on standards and regulations, we were able to move them to a place where their standards agency introduced a new regulatory framework, but the regulatory framework they issued actually reflected the years of conversations we had about how to approach standards and technical regulations. And so we were able to ensure that that regulatory framework, even though it wasn't in place yet, but that it reflected our market-oriented approach to standards and technical regulations. Similarly, in the Trade and Technology Council that we're working on with the EU, we're working very closely with Grant's team and our National Institute of Standards and Technologies to develop a common approach on regulation of artificial intelligence, where neither the United States nor the EU really have a comprehensive regulation on AI yet. But before either of us gets too far ahead of ourselves, let's make sure that we align on some of the basics so that when those regulations do get implemented, they may not be 100% identical, but the divergence will be far more limited than it would have been without that dialogue. The last thing I would mention is, of course, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is another vehicle that we are using to a brand new type of vehicle, very different from a trade agreement, to still try to achieve some standardization and alignment on a number of topics. And I think the reason all of these are important, I should have mentioned this at the outset, is that what we are seeing is, as you all know, that tariffs remain in some places and they're still significant, but they are a much less directly relevant trade barrier today than they were years ago. And increasingly, we're paying attention to the non-tariff barriers. And so we're having to use tools that target those non-tariff barriers, and which is a very different conversation from a tariff discussion. So we're using that. So by fighting the existing barriers, supporting the implementation of agreements, and then coming up with new dialogues to shape governments thinking ahead of regulation are the vehicles that we're using to achieve that objective. Let me stop there and invite Grant or any other questions.
Yeah, we welcome any questions, comments. We have a question or two as well.
Arun, you mentioned the beginning of an AI conversation, and this may be important to several of the folks on our committee. If you could highlight the top, one or two points that the U.S. would advocate are important in an AI agreement? What are those?
Yeah, Jeff. So let me be honest. I don't think I think that's still a work in progress. What we are working on right now with the Europeans is some initial definitional issues about how to even approach the regulation of AI. So this includes where we are looking at cases of bias. How do we define bias? What is and what are the implications of that? Before we move to a regulation to address bias, let's make clear that we agree on what the actual challenge is. So we're that very early stage. We're working very closely with OSTP, our Office of Science and Technology Policy, on this. So we're not yet in a position. While we have, we're not yet in a position to say here are our guidelines for how we should approach AI regulation. We're not there yet. We're sort of working in discrete components, building up to something like that.
Thanks. Other questions for Grant or Arun?
Maybe I can ask a question on kind of where do you see the role of China changing in all of this? A lot of American industry has significant presence in China, either for manufacturing and exporting, or for manufacturing there itself for local consumption. Of course, a lot has changed in that. Maybe some thoughts or comments on kind of how do you see that role changing, and then the impact on American industry itself, and then how do U.S. companies navigate through that? Maybe any thoughts on that would be helpful.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to start, and Grant, please chime in as well. I think we recognize that China is an important global market. So our industry needs to sell in and succeed in China, and so we're supportive of helping our companies do that. There are a number of sectors that do not raise the types of security concerns or other issues that you see in some sectors. So we want to make sure that our companies can compete in the Chinese market and win in the Chinese market, because it's an important market for a number of sectors. We definitely want to support them doing that. But what we're also seeing at the same time is, given what has happened over the last few years, what we're seeing and what we're hearing is companies just wanting to make sure that as part of their building the resilience of their supply chains, that they're really avoiding and the chokeholds that existed and that we've seen kind of take prominence in the pandemic. You all know this better than I do. And I think that has created opportunities for a number of other countries around the world to be alternatives that could be incorporated into global supply chains, that countries that may have been only moderately involved in these supply chains can play a greater role because companies are looking to diversify. And so we have worked with our trading partners, and will continue to do so through vehicles like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, to strengthen these economies as potentially attractive destinations of investment, to support our ultimate goal of really building those resilient supply chains.
I think you covered the waterfront. I would just add, especially overseeing the office that is spending a lot of time day to day on supply chain issues, but also does the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and thinks about investment screening and thinks about what Chinese industrial policy and impact is having on particular supply chains and industries. You heard from the Secretary and Director Deese about critical minerals, for instance. It's a great example where we're thinking in helping US industries compete, there needs to be access to these critical minerals, and helping the United States maintain and continue its technological edge in some core areas in particular. We need to be finding solutions here. And so these issues are raising to the top as we're trying to think about what China is looking to do in having choke points at particular parts of the supply chain that we think will be really adverse to US growth. And that's a place where we want to be working with you and are thinking about your recommendations. And you heard more specific reactions already on that, but we're, in addition to what Arun's talking about and his work, trying to have a strategic sense of how can we support industry competitiveness in this geopolitical environment, and with what China's strategy, its Made in China 2025 strategy, and its supply chain strategy will mean for US industry. And finally, I would just add as well, particularly since we deal with forced labor issues in our shop, another issue that comes up a lot in our consultations with industry is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the supply chain monitoring and the due diligence that they need to be undertaking. And so from the industry and analysis perspective, and we're trying to work with partners, the Department of Homeland Security, but also in the private sector, to get out more information on what implementation looks like there. And we see that as also an important differentiator because it's forced labor, of course, is just anathema to core US values. And it also creates an artificial advantage to companies that rely on it in competing against US companies that do not. So we see it as very much an economic issue in addition to a human rights issue and an issue of principle as well. So those are some examples. Of course, there's a lot to say about China's role in the world stage and how it affects global competitiveness.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful, Grant and Arun. And Arun, I like the idea that you mentioned of the work your team is doing around working with other countries that are probably benefiting or could benefit from the geopolitical changes that are happening, and the Indo-Pacific conversation is a good one. It would be helpful to see how, how you see the relative progress of American companies in those countries vis-a-vis, which I'm sure and China is doing the same, or other countries are doing the same, looking for those same investment opportunities, and how our progress is going or what support is needed. I think that would be really helpful to see, so we take advantage of the moment in time, geopolitical issues that are going on. So I think that would be really helpful. We see that in India, we see that in Malaysia, we see that in Indonesia. Lots of opportunities for US companies, but we have to make sure that we're able to work with those governments to make sure we're well positioned, to take advantage of that opportunity. So I really like that idea.
Yeah, and Revathi, I think that one of the things that is important, and one of the messages we've been consistent in delivering to all of our like-minded partners is, look, there's definitely opportunity in this moment in time, and we are supportive of our like-minded partners seizing those opportunities to be part of our trusted supply chains. But let's be clear, there's a competition for that. So just because there is diversification in supply chains does not mean, for example, country X is the natural choice for US companies. I mean, US companies do have a choice on where to diversify. And so we've encouraged our trading partners to really see this as an opportunity, but recognize that with that opportunity comes a burden to improve their investment climate. Vietnam has to compete with Thailand, has to compete with Malaysia, has to compete with Indonesia, and that's just within ASEAN. So making clear that let's leverage that competition to strengthen all of these economies together so that they can all be attractive destinations. And then our companies can choose based on their needs and requirements what makes sense for a supply chain destination.
Just wanted to add one point, and then, sorry, Revathi, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'd love to call either you, Arun, or Grant to just give you some feedback on that and our experiences and what we're seeing, if that could be helpful.
Definitely. Would love to do that.
I know we're at time. I just wanted to add one comment on that regard and pose a question maybe for future consideration. And I particularly like the specificity of the markets that you were mentioning in the example just now. And as I mentioned on Friday, I'm literally flying to Indonesia to talk about advanced manufacturing because we see strategically so many needs there and so many opportunities for US companies to compete. And so that's the type of work that we'll be doing. If going forward, this committee has additional feedback on particular suggestions on expanding exports, particular markets, other things that carry on this conversation, we'd be happy to continue the dialogue or respond more. Or if there are initiatives that you found particularly successful that you think should be replicated, if there are additional thoughts, we welcome those both either through the committee or individually in your capacity for your organization to talk offline. That would be great as well. But thanks for these recommendations already received and for the time today to be able to respond and engage on them.
Thank you, Grant and Arun. Our next speaker is not scheduled until 1:10 Eastern time. It'll be General Lyons. So we have a break right now scheduled for the next 20 minutes. I think that'll let folks on the East Coast have lunch and folks on the West Coast who skipped breakfast grab something. So we'll reconvene at 1:10 Eastern time. So retired General Stephen Lyons is the Port and Supply Chain Envoy to the Biden-Harris administration's Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force. He took command August 24th, 2018, becoming the 13th commander of the U.S. Transportation Command, U.S. Transcom, one of 11 combatant commands in the Department of Defense. U.S. Transcom's mission is to protect and sustain military power globally in order to assure our friends and allies, deter potential adversaries, and if necessary, respond to win decisively. Lyons' experience spans 36 years of military service in positions of progressive leadership responsibility. So we're honored, General Lyons, to welcome you to our committee and look forward to your remarks, given the point of view you now have as the Port and Supply Chain Envoy. Thanks for joining us.
Well, Jeff, thanks. I appreciate it. And thanks to the entire team for what you're doing. I know you all have day jobs and what you're doing and your commitment to really economic prosperity for the future of America is really important. So thanks for doing that. I've been watching, from afar, but very fascinated by the work that you're doing. My piece of this is really, I would describe in the context of the broader supply chain disruption, and you guys are working microchips and a number of other issues, energy related kinds of topics. I'm focused largely on the goods movement piece of the puzzle. So John Picari, jumped in there initially, did some great work, just kind of triaging the situation. You remember a year ago when there was 109 ships queued up at the port of LA Long Beach, and all the cartoons were flying across the papers that Christmas wasn't coming, and all that. And so I kind of stepped into the stride that he had, expanded a little bit to more broadly than the West Coast and more broadly than ports, is that really all the linkages that move freight across the supply chain system. So I know we don't have a lot of time. What I thought I'd do is just kind of take a couple minutes up front, describe contextually what I've seen so far and what I'm seeing in terms of progress, and then open it up to Q&A. I'm happy to take questions, rather suggestions often is what I get as well, and I appreciate that. So thanks for having me today. Hey, I typically describe this in kind of a couple different fashions. I'll talk a little bit about what I describe as the logistics engineering piece of the puzzle, quite frankly predictable outcome of what we saw, and then I'll touch a little bit on the economic aspects, both macro and micro, and then kind of give a little bit of a progress update on what we're seeing in terms of the indicators of improvement over time. So if we go back to early 2000, we can all remember how the pandemic disrupted every aspect of our lives across the globe. And at that time, particularly early in the year, a lot of capacity, I'm talking about transportation capacity, was taken out of the supply chain because the world stopped as we knew it, and folks really didn't think that there was going to be work. And so capacity came out, a lot of, workers got furloughed, et cetera, et cetera. There was labor challenges, just people getting to work. You recall all of that. Well, what immediately followed there was, of course, an unforeseen, unforecasted spike in consumer demand, fueled by some stimulus money, fueled by the fact that services were shut down. Folks were investing in staycations instead of vacations. E-commerce was just booming, right? And so what I would describe as kind of the bullwhip effect, we're still seeing some of that, and I'll describe what we're seeing. But obviously, record volumes of freight moved across that time frame, unforecasted, unforeseen. And so when you take the fact that we, reduced capacity, we increased demand beyond any expectation, and you superimpose that upon a supply chain that's by design, designed to operate at high utilization, because it's very expensive, right? Nobody buys into that level of resilience in a supply chain. There's some resilience, but not the kind that's going to, be able to absorb a pandemic. And so what we saw really was perfectly predictable from a logistics engineering perspective, record volumes of freight as any one node in the system. And I often say the supply chain is probably misnamed. It kind of implies that if you just fix one link in the chain, you could fix the system. It's not like that at all. It's a very complex system of systems, very complex ecosystem driven by, market incentives in the private sector, et cetera, and a lot of people operating in silos. But when any one aspect of a terminal or any aspect you want to think of in a good movements chain reaches or nears maximum capacity, your backlogs and queues start to go up in a nonlinear kind of fashion. Well, that's exactly what we saw, right? And we're still seeing some of that right now. As you think about, kind of the pig and the python analogy, first you saw it manifest itself with the 109 ships outside LA Long Beach. And by the way, today there are no ships in the queue outside San Pedro Bay. There are in other locations. Obviously, when you push in one area, it opens up, expands a little bit in another area, and you saw it kind of work its way through. And, at the end of the day, these record volumes of freight ended up, everybody had a little bit of a, stack initial requirements. And by the time you get from local to regional to national level, you got a lot of freight moving. And frankly, no place for it to go. Distribution centers still today are at 98, 99% capacity, which leads to a lot of queuing and backlogs that really transcend all the way back through the transportation system when inventory is stored in transit, as it is, if it's sitting at a terminal that was designed to be a transfer location, not a storage location. And of course, that forces, the inland terminals I'll use, for example, the rail, the inland rail at Chicago, Dallas, Memphis, et cetera, when their ramps get full, not designed to be stackable, they start to meter what comes out of the marine terminals, obviously, and to prevent gridlock, because gridlock is worse than a slow and unpredictable system. And so what you saw there was a very erratic, very volatile, very congested system, unlike anything anybody had experienced, because everybody had become very accustomed to a very reliable system. Inventory in motion was just part of your supply chain, because you knew it was going to show up at the right time, at the right place, with the right stuff. And that all went to complete chaos. And you all saw that, you all felt it in various different kind of ways in every sector. And when I talked to senior folks at in the big companies, they would say that the cost of congestion, right, probably ran about 6 to 10% of their annual revenue. So a huge cost. I'm just talking about the cost of transportation. I'm also talking about the missed opportunity cost, the cost of excess inventory management, and these kinds of things. So, I tell people that there's no magic wand here. The key to success at this point, without more infrastructure, and that'll come in time. That's the good news. It will come in time. But in the near term, the key to success is two simple rules, and that is freight in motion must stay in motion until it reaches the consignee. That's easy to say, not always easy to do when your distribution centers are full, but that's key, right? And the second really is the transportation assets, the conveyances have to remain in cycle, and constant cycle. Has to remain in constant movement. Now, a couple examples. There are way more ships in the liner services today than are actually needed, because the cargo's not turning
I wonder
fast
why
enough.
Waze did that. Waze is always real good.
If I look at chassis, which is a natural, if you look at distribution centers being filled and you want terminals cleared, well, the container becomes a natural storage site on top of a wheeled chassis. The chassis dwell time in a place like Chicago, when it goes, from 3 to 5 days to 10 to 12 days, it takes 25,000 chassis to make up the difference. And of course, those can't be produced overnight. So theory of the case is you got to keep things in motion. And I realize that's easier said than done. So, let me just kind of talk to the economics piece of this. And there's some good work that's been done. New York Fed Reserve's done some work. Others have done some work that really correlate supply chain congestion directly with the inflationary impacts, as many other things, obviously probably on par with energy. And then you've got other factors, the Ukraine war and so forth and so on. So at the macro sense, I think there's still some work to be done in this whole supply chain aspect as we think about the future and we think about, how we should study this in our MBA programs. At the micro perspective, I would share to you that there's some competing interests going on, natural, right? I mean, completely expected. You've got this bullwhip of inventory still moving through the system. You've got congested distribution centers with little options for storage that don't add to congestion. And so the supply chain experts in these companies are under severe pressure, as you can appreciate. I mean, the last 2 years have been heck on them. Their costs have been way out of control. They're under pressure to reduce costs. And in a micro sense, each of these large companies have fairly advanced algorithms on what it makes the best sense to leave something in transit, storage in transit, and when it makes best sense to accept it into your distribution center. The challenge with that may make sense monetarily, but the challenge with that is anything that adds to congestion. So anything that's stationary at a terminal or stationary in the transit system that's cargo is adding to congestion. So you got some competing interests at the micro level, trying to save a few bucks, but at the macro level, having enormous macroeconomic impacts on big companies as well as the consumer. And what I tell our team is, look, I mean, this isn't, we're not here to solve world hunger. We're trying to collaborate in a way that accelerates market correction. I'll come back to that. And at the end of the day, the North Star is quite simply We need to, restore credibility, reliability in the supply chain, and we need to bring costs down for the consumer. So if we're doing anything in that regard, that's a little bit of progress. So let me just kind of talk for a minute on what we're seeing that does indicate some progress. Obviously, a lot of this is natural market correction. Collaboration is high amongst parties that are fiercely competitive. There have been some real winners in this and some losers in this financially, I'm talking about. I mean, congestion has equated to enormous revenue for many in the transportation sector, and congestion has equated to enormous cost, particularly for shippers and beneficial cargo owners, and ultimately the consumer, who ultimately pays the pass on cost of this. So what's going on as we see it? Obviously, the market has cooled somewhat, and that has given us some breathing space, because you really cannot address the logistics queuing problem unless you can bring your supply and demand back into some level of balance. And that's what's starting to occur now. You see some of the congestion reducing, you see delivery times improving from where they were, triple digits, to where we're seeing now, probably in the 60-day. I'm talking about the Trans-Pacific trade lanes. You see significant reductions in the costs associated with shipping containers, actually dropped at a rate faster than I anticipated. And you see a level of cooperation, I would say, amongst very divergent stakeholders, and a recognition of how blind we were in the early days to come together with some data initiatives. Really, I wouldn't describe as in transit, right? When I'm talking about this at the federal level, I'm talking about what are those macroeconomic indicators of supply and demand inside the goods movement process to indicate the health of the system. And so I'll just I'll pause there. I mean, there's a couple of wild cards out there that we're watching closely that you're all very attuned to. Obviously, they're labor related, whether it's longshoremen or railway. I've been working very closely with Secretary Walsh on those issues. At the moment, I would just say collaboration does remain high. We are seeing some progress. We know we have a long way to go, actually, to be honest with you, to get to a level of reliability to where companies can actually, expect something to show up when it's supposed to show up, the right time, right place, the right goods. In the meantime, I think what we're all seeing, right, is especially the big retailers discounting cargo because they've got to move the cargo to create space and to create some level of normalcy. So with that, I'll just kind of pause. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to go anywhere you want, but I just thought I'd tee it up with just a couple comments and open to wherever you want to go.
Thanks, General Lyons, for your comments today, and especially for your leadership. Questions?
It's a great audience today.
Hey,
no hard question. Not even C.H. Robinson. Not even James.
General Lyons, Don Freisen here with Lowe. Just want to just endorse some of the comments you made. First of all, thanks for summarizing the health of what's going on, particularly from an ocean perspective. We too are seeing improvements, whether it be in spot rates, contract rates are now being renegotiated with the carriers. We're seeing a lot more available equipment than we've been seeing in the past. And as a result, when we start to take a look at our supply chain cost as a percent of revenue, it is certainly going down. And that's really important for our metrics as well as for our customers, so that we can start to take some of these savings and drive toward pricing action. So it's been a real benefit for us, and we certainly appreciate all the efforts that have gone into helping us with that.
Well, thanks. No, I appreciate the comments. I think for all of us, I'd offer, coming out of the back end, and I am actually cognizant that we don't think about some things soon. We're going to miss a window of opportunity as kind of the crisis stage dwindles a little bit, but I think everybody has increased their knowledge and certainly expanded their lexicon with vis-a-vis supply chain broader logistics kind of concerns more broadly than just cost savings. So, the traditional approach to logistics by most large companies was how to squeeze more cost to optimize revenue. Certainly understandable. But I also think there's a recognition, or there should be a recognition, of a level of the enablement that it provides, and the level of effort that it takes to be comfortable in the risk assessment in certain levels of resiliency in supply chain. And so I've seen a lot of work in some companies really stand up complete efforts in that regard, which I think has been good. It doesn't lead to a one or the other approach to onshoring, offshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring kind of approach, but it does, I think, force us into a different risk assessment model. And I'm open to thoughts on you guys might have on that. But I see a couple of hands here, so I'll defer to questions. I think I got Willie up on the far left.
Well, Willie, if you don't mind, just let me get a couple other folks. Bob, we haven't heard from Bob yet.
Thank you, General Lyons. As you might know, earlier this year, Commissioner Bensel of the Federal Maritime Commission released a report on the supply chain. And as part of that, one of the things he noted is that China produces over 95% of the containers manufactured around the world. So with China dominating that manufacturing, do you see that as a significant threat to the U.S. supply chain, where they're monopolizing that particular product?
Yeah, well, I think it's an excellent question. There's so many examples you could fill in the blank. You could use a container example that Carl referenced and the good work that he's done. Again, I think this is really a strategic risk assessment. I don't equate, containers with computer chips or some other high tech kinds of things. And I think that I don't think it's an all or nothing in terms of onshoring. I think it's you've got to look at each of these sectors and come to the conclusion about what the risk is, how much, if any, resiliency exists, and how you would recover in the event, of a major disruption. So, when it comes to containers, especially the containers we use today, which are not high tech, it's a very industry is in a very old place in this area. There's a couple companies that are working fast to try to catch up, but I don't see that as a high risk area. I do think that diversification, though, beyond China is important for many things, and I think we have to continue to look at that. There's also all these discussions going on about the Made in America clauses, and again, it's not a one or a zero. There are many like-minded allies and partners that produce things that are incredibly valuable, just like we produce things that are incredibly valuable to them. And our exports are as important as our imports. So it's a long way to say, I think it depends on the risk assessment. I think there are many other areas, and not all, when I look at the shipping conglomerates, not all are equal in terms of their contributions to the U.S. economy and U.S. national defense, by the way, because many of these shipping companies contribute ships underneath the maritime security programs, and others don't. And I think the China threat is something we have to look at constantly. I completely agree with that.
Jason, did you have a question?
I do. General Lyons, first off, shout out to Andrew. Thank you for making him available. He's a great resource. I just had one kind of quick question. I appreciated your description of the tremendous demand outstripping supply that we just went through in the last 2 years. And you alluded to the potential that the freight markets might be switching around. And so when supply outstrips demand, which inevitably those of us who've been in the industry realize that the pendulum swings, what tools do you think should be in the administration's toolbox in that environment when supply outstrips demand to help the supply side, just like we did help the demand side.
Yeah, it's a fair question. But I have to say, and I'm very cognizant, particularly if I look at the, the ocean carrier side of the house. I've been tracking them, known many of these guys for many years. I remember the bad times, and they got lucky on a couple good years here, and they're already kind of headed on the downward side of the business cycle. What we wouldn't want to see, though, is a return to 2% margins. That's not healthy for anybody. But I think we do see, right, when we look at the order books and we look at the current capacity, we can see we're on a glide path to excess capacity on the ocean carrier side and the container side. I don't think we see that on the ro-ro, and we certainly don't see it on the tanker side of the house. So I think the market will adjust to that, and as will the supply. You can already see some of the routes have been adjusted. The supplies side will adjust to the demand. That's hard to anticipate, obviously, and never get it perfectly right. So I don't see a huge federal government policy role or regulatory role, and I tell people, and you may have heard me say this, Jason, I'm not a regulator. I'm not a policy guy. I talk to them regularly, obviously. I think the FMC has a role in this space, in the intermodal space, largely especially under OSRA, to ensure that we improve something that I think we need to improve drastically, which is transparency, and make sure that we're incentivizing fluidity. And I'm talking largely, as you can appreciate, with the demurrage detention and the associated fees, because right now, I think they're designed in a perverse kind of way, and they do need a little bit of oversight in that regard. So, and I've talked to Dan Maffei, Carl, obviously the FMC team about this. They're aligned, but it takes a little bit of time to get there. I think that's where I think the federal piece plays above and beyond, the regulatory safety aspects that DOT traditionally has in some of these sectors. So, by the way, I'm happy to have you push back on me on that. I'm just giving you my personal view.
Just opening up the question. I'm not sure if I've got answers for it, but just opening up the question.
I think, what I hear a lot, to be honest with you, is, and I happen to believe this, you have to be careful what you ask for when you ask for the federal government to step in to what's essentially, private sector, market-driven, activities. There is a role in certain spaces, but it ought to be a minimal role. And I think one of those spaces is the work that you're doing with Andrew Peterson on flow at a very macro level.
Willie, you had a question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, General Lenz, for what you've been doing. So I agree with you, especially if you look at on the ocean carrier side of the order book and supply coming on stream. How do you think about like the new IMO regulations that are starting January 1st? I mean, because in principle, that could further contract supply. And, I don't know if you thought about how that might impact things.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And, for the container folks whose order books are, filled and they've got ships coming out compliant, they're going to be in a different set of circumstances. And I think they're still going to end up with excess capacity that they'll have to take out of their trade lanes. But for the ro-ro side of the market and the tanker side of the market, I think it's more problematic because you don't see those orders out there. And I think folks are still trying to figure out where to go on the carbon neutral future. Most folks that I talk to in industry think that liquefied natural gas is a temporary transitory bridge to something else, but that something else hasn't been, clearly identified. And so I think to some degree, folks, because you're ordering, years in advance, are shooting a little bit in the dark on how to keep pace. But I do think, and in fact, I heard this yesterday when I was down at Charleston, clearly from one company that I met with, that it will squeeze capacity out, over the next couple of years, just based on compliance.
Just because it's slow steaming, for example.
Yes.
So that means, so you're seeing kind of a tight capacity outlook, even though prices are down now, right? I mean, in some sense, a lot of people are saying this is going to squeeze some of the smaller operators with the older ships out.
Yeah, I think in the container market, I think you're still gonna see excess capacity just because what's in the trade lanes right now is more than they traditionally would have, and their order books are filled.
Yeah.
So I think they're gonna have, relatively useful ships that aren't gonna, they're not gonna, they won't want to put them in their trade lanes because they're trying to balance their demand supply
Right.
price equation. I don't think it's the case though in the other markets like the ro-ro and the tanker market. I think that's where you're going to see a much more significant and visible squeeze. That's my sense for just what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. I haven't done deep analysis on it, but that's what I'm seeing right now.
Okay, thank you.
We have just a couple of minutes with General Lyons. Any other questions?
General, I have a quick question that's a little bit off center. I'm Ursula Burns. By the way, good to meet you and really honored to meet you. And it's around food and the transportation of food. We spend a lot of time thinking about a lot of the hard non-perishable goods like chips and so on and so on. Is there an eye that we should be having on more perishable goods like food, and how does that play into this whole equation that you're working and we're all working to actually liberalize the supply chain?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Ag does have some folks. I don't know if they have anybody on this team here. Elaine Trevino is on our team that's specifically focused from a USDA perspective. I think a couple things, one of which was an eye opener for me, and I'll get to that in a minute. But so in the agriculture side, the exports is really what I think was most impacted by the congestion. Even though they saw some growth, they didn't see nearly the growth that could have materialized had they been more fluid and had they been able to get their exports to markets that were growing. So the export side of the equation is certainly a concern to make sure that the United States, which does extremely well in agriculture, is able to export product. On the import side, though, you've got other things that feed that supply chain, like fertilizers and so forth. What surprised me is, it probably won't be surprising to this team, though, when I'm talking domestically now, just inside the U.S. and the transportation side of the U.S., certain sectors like food, frankly, clean water, and certain other sectors are highly reliant on the railroad. And so when we went through the interagency process on a potential shutdown, these were the issues that really got flagged to the highest levels. And we think about a longshoreman issue on the West Coast. That's problematic, there's no doubt. But we're talking about, are we going to get our latest Sony TV? If we're thinking about a railroad disruption, we really are fundamentally talking about clean drinking water, purification of wastewater, food supply, these kinds of issues. And so from that, I'm talking about, from a goods movement and a movement transportation perspective, that was concerning. Now, Ag and FDA had some great insights on all this in the interagency process. And I wouldn't, based on what I learned there, I wouldn't take, to your point, I would not take food security for granted. I don't know if that helps or not.
It does, thank you.
And great to see you from my almost hometown of Rochester. At least my university town of Rochester.
Yeah, almost my hometown too. I don't live there anymore, but I lived there for almost 30 years.
Well, General Lyons, thank you for your time today, and again for your leadership and your thoughtful insights. It was great to have you.
Well, thanks, Jeff, for what you and the team are doing. I know how busy you are with your day jobs, and for you to do this for the nation is greatly appreciated. So always available for cards and letters. Wish you guys all the best. Take care.
Thank you. So General Lyons was the last of our speakers. Are there any questions or other business from committee members? If not, I want to turn it over to Ursula for closing remarks, and then I'll wrap us up.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we were thinking about when we were scheduling this meeting with Commerce was to make sure that we can kind of level set ourselves on the work that we've done, how it dovetails with what Commerce is thinking about and the government feds are thinking about in general, and whether or not we were on the right stack of mail. And if we were not on the right stack of mail, how do we shift and adjust? And I think that we accomplished that today in that we are actually clearer on some of the areas that we have to focus on and can focus on, but also, in my opinion, very excitingly on areas that we have to pick up and work on. And we discovered some of that in interagency work and working with energy and areas that I've taken a couple of actions on. So I'm excited about the go forward. We still have a ways to go, but I think Indra asked earlier, is there stuff that we can see? And we can actually say, we tried to do it and it was done. I think we're starting to see the fruits of that labor. So thank you for everyone who's engaged. There are a lot of people who are still on the phone, but a lot that aren't behind the scenes that have helped with this. And thank you very much. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Ursula. Well, we've come to the end of our scheduled agenda. I want to thank Assistant Secretary Harris, Secretary Raimondo, Director Deese, Assistant Secretary Venkataraman, General Lyons for your insightful remarks and feedback on our recommendations. Thanks to the members of the ACSCC, including our government partners. Our subcommittee's work over the next few months will focus on partnering with the appropriate government officials across departments to refine key recommendations regarding U.S. workforce, freight infrastructure, and key programs highlighted today. We'll work toward a next meeting, likely in early February, as I said earlier, and between now and the end of November, we'll announce our calendar of meetings, likely 3 for the full year 2023. I personally remain confident that together we can make meaningful progress in a host of areas. We're now adjourned. Thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff, Ursula, everyone. Take care.